All right, hello and welcome to our next Welty at Home discussion on Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We've made it to week 4 of our Welty at Home book club, and today we're discussing volume 2, chapters 1 through 9 of Pride and Prejudice. If your book isn't divided into volumes, that would be chapters 24 to 32. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden. And I've got to say, if you were part of last week's discussion, I let us run too long and we got cut off, and I apologize for that. So I'll do a better job of watching the time and wrapping us up. So if you have thoughts that are carried over from last week, I hope that you still have been holding those thoughts and can bring us back into that discussion. And I know that we'll have a bunch of new things to talk about too, now that we're into volume 2. Just a reminder, if you want to comment, be sure to click the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen and click raise hand. And so we'll all be looking for your raised hands out there. I'm so pleased once again to be joined today by our moderators, Susan Allen Ford, Professor Emerita of Delta State University and editor of Persuasions, the Jane Austen Journal, and Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and Professor Emerita at Millsaps College. So Susan and Suzanne, which of you wants to start today?
What do you think, Susan?
Do you want to start since you have some things left over from the last?
All right, yeah, since I missed last time and didn't get to chime in, I had 2 things I wanted to put out there for your consideration. One was in a exchange of letters, Eudora Welty and Ross MacDonald were talking about a story by Patrick O'Brien called The Walker. And this was a mystery story. And Ross MacDonald, Eudora recommended it to Ross MacDonald, and he replied, "That story is really frightening. It betrays us into complicity," that us, the readers, it betrays us into complicity. And I thought some of you were suggesting last time, and I agree with this, that in a way, in Pride and Prejudice, we are not betrayed maybe, but seduced into complicity and into misjudgments, and therefore indicted in our pride and our prejudice as well. I think maybe Marion was talking about that last time. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that I've really been impressed with the whole investigation of what it means to make a good marriage, and the examples of bad marriages like the Bennets, the example of one where people are coping, at least the wife is coping and managing, like Charlotte and Mr. Collins, the good marriage of the Gardners. And I think we've seen from an early conversation that Elizabeth and Darcy had at Netherfield that both of them are looking for a kind of equality in marriage, and not and which seems a very modern sort of thing to me. So those were 2 concerns I had from the past, and wanted just to see what anybody else thought about that. And then my other thing I wanted to talk about today, whenever it fits in, Susan, is the conversation that Elizabeth and Darcy have when he arrives and she's by herself at the parsonage. And she unloads on Mr. Collins, which I thought, based on what Sarah was saying last time, that we have this sort of standard where you can't even speak to somebody until you've been introduced. But then Elizabeth feels free to really tear into Mr. Collins to Mr. Darcy in a very unguarded fashion. So, and a very sage one, but unguarded. So,
Yeah.
So those were my 3 things I wanted to raise for today, and looking back to the past. And I'm awfully glad to be back. I missed it last time. I enjoyed watching all of you online in the replay, in the instant replay.
Well, I'm joining y'all from Victoria, where I've been at a Jane Austen conference all weekend talking about Sense and Sensibility instead of Pride and Prejudice. But anyway, it's kind of neat to be back into this novel. I think that the issues that Suzanne has raised are good ones, and they kind of straddle the last part of what we were, the part we were reading last time, the last part of volume 1 and the beginning of volume 2. And volume 2 starts off, I just think, in a really interesting place. I mean, we are dealing with all the crushed hopes and expectations. The first sentence of the volume is, Miss Bingley's letter arrived and put an end to doubt. The very first sentence conveyed the assurance of their being all settled in London for the winter, and concluded with her brother's regret at not having had time to pay his respects to his friends in Hertfordshire before he left the country. Hope was over, entirely over. And when Jane could attend to the rest of the letter, she found little except the professed affection of the writer that could give her any comfort. So, we're beginning in this really dark mode. And so how do we see Elizabeth and Jane in particular adjusting to everything that's happened? What do we see in their thinking, their behavior at this stage of the novel, especially, although not necessarily only in terms of the issues that Suzanne's bringing up of marriage and Monica.
Well, I'm really glad that you're starting with this dark mode that the volume starts with, because some of y'all know, as I started reading this weekend, this line of Elizabeth's on my page 133 in chapter 24, when she says, there are few people whom I really love and still fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I'm dissatisfied with it, and every day confirms my belief of the inconsistency of all human characters and of the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of either merit or sense. So I went to Twitter and wrote, between Elizabeth Bennet and Jane Eyre and Jo March, like, I feel like one of the reasons why these characters so resonate with me is because they show how when smart women have to deal with the world, they get really grumpy. I have had 12,000 people like my tweet, and it's been retweeted over 1,000 times. I think some Jane Austen groups have picked up on it. And so I really think that there's something to be said here about, we get to see Elizabeth be grumpy. And grumpiness is, I've written about ugliness, I've written about tackiness. Somebody in here said that I should, just add grumpiness and eventually I'll have all 7 dwarfs. But I really appreciate Elizabeth is grumpy, but then, Jane then kind of echoes Wickham here of saying, you really need to not let yourself go on like this. Right after this, she says, you don't make allowances for differences of situation and temper. And so we get Jane, similar to Wickham, kind of telling Elizabeth that she should calm herself down. But I love this opening of Elizabeth just getting to be really grumpy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's grumpy, but I mean, I think that Jane is also right that Elizabeth is starting here down this path, where, that every day confirms my belief, what you just read, in the inconsistency of all human characters and of the little dependence that can be placed on the appearance of either merit or sense. And Jane says, my dear Lizzie, do not give way to such feelings as these. They will ruin your happiness. And I just think that's so interesting. Jane is basically saying, okay, you were wrong. And she even says, I was wrong, right? In my judgment of Miss Bingley. But then she goes on to say, but I still think that I was right to behave as I did, because neither of us really had evidence about what was gonna transpire. John?
My only thing about, I took that, this is in the context of her talking to her older sister and Elizabeth. And I just attribute some of this to her idealism.
Mhm.
And also isn't she less than 20? Her
Yes.
lack of
Well,
experience.
not
Almost
21, she
21.
says.
Mhm.
Is she
Yeah, so
okay?
she's
21?
20. Mhm. She's 20.
And so, and she's led a pretty sheltered life, except for with respect to, she appears to be a voracious reader. And so, and you've got to put that in the context of, what she's had to read up to that point. And so, and she's just being hard on herself. And she needs to get knocked out of it. And I think her sister does a good job of knocking her out of that. She can be so judgmental very quickly, but then she'll get out of it, as we'll see later. And I don't know if it's in this part, but she essentially says later, this is a bad paraphrase, but she says she's always willing to examine herself and to change.
Mhm.
And I think, that needs to be, her remarks here just need to be put in that context, or should be put in that context. I'm a big fan of Elizabeth, obviously.
I think we all should be.
Yes.
But yeah, I want to come back to that in a minute and look at her judgments of Bingley. But before that, Marianne, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody, and I've kind of forgotten the date. There was a very famous poem written in America about this time, describing the angel in the parlor. Women were supposed to be angels in the house or in the parlor. And I love the fact that Elizabeth is so not an angel. We have to, celebrate that along with her grumpiness.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Though that poem I think is more like 1850 or 60, somewhere in there. It's Coventry Patmore who writes that Angel in the House. But I mean, he's clearly taking up this notion that has been, culturally embedded for quite a while, of the woman as the guiding spirit of the home and the man as the person who walks out into the public world. And because of those differences, there are all kinds of traits that go with them. And Fordyce's sermons, just to get back to Mr. Collins for a minute, Fordyce's sermons really is one of the big texts that helps to inculcate this notion of femininity and what woman should be. So you're right. I mean, I think she's pushing against those constrictions, and to pick up Monica's words again, I mean, that may lead to a certain amount of grumpiness, but also anger, I mean, to actually take that into even a more serious direction. Jacob?
I think I'd like to add to the grumpiness and the anger of Elizabeth's character by saying there is a kind of popular debate that's been occurring around movies recently. And I'm gonna, when Star Wars came back, there was this stereotype. Some of you may have heard of it, because the main character in Star Wars is a woman now, and they call her a Mary Sue. And if you Google Mary Sue, my computer says right now, a Mary Sue is a type of female character who is depicted as unrealistically lacking in flaws or weaknesses. In short, a Mary Sue is a kind of too perfect woman character.
Mm-hmm.
I bring this up because I really admire how Elizabeth is very imperfect as a character. Like, she's grumpy, she's quick to judgment sometimes. When I was reading for this week, one thing I really find striking about her, this is a counterintuitive argument to celebrate her flaws, her ability to self-deceive, as good as she is at being perceptive of certain characters, she's not so good at reading other characters like Mr. Darcy. So I guess what I'm trying to say, with her grumpiness, with her anger, with her flaws, I think it's a remarkable aspect of her character and I think it's important that we bring that up in her. I guess that's what I want to say.
Yeah, I that's really good. And I can now bring in my Mr. Bingley point to go with that. So, I mean, look what she says. This is the third paragraph of chapter 1 of volume 2. In my volume, it's in page 131. That this was about halfway down the paragraph. That he was really fond of Jane, she doubted no more than she had ever done. And much as she had always been disposed to like him, she could not think without anger, hardly without contempt, on that easiness of temper, that want of proper resolution, which now made him the slave of his designing friends, and led him to sacrifice his own happiness to the caprice of their inclinations. Well, turn back then to pages 48, 49 in this volume, and this is this is in chapter 10. This is that scene at Netherfield, where they're having an argument about the easiness of Bingley's disposition and how he wants to do everything quickly. And Darcy says, this is about halfway down, I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know. And if, as you were mounting on your horse, a friend were to say, Bingley, you'd better stay till next week, you would probably do it. You would probably not go. And at another word, might stay a month. Okay, well, that's kind of what Elizabeth is responding to here. But at the time she said to Darcy, you have only proved by this that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You've shown him off much more now than he did himself. And then Darcy says, and then she says in a few more paragraphs, to yield readily, easily to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. And Darcy says to yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. So, I mean, exactly the situation that Elizabeth or Darcy have, both of them together, have invented in the first volume is now what we're seeing in the second volume. And Elizabeth is now getting a much more complicated sense, so she's not thinking about it, than what she had before. I mean, this is now a problem because she's seeing how the ramifications it has on somebody she loves. Yeah, Monica?
Do you think, as you're reading it this time, do you think that part of her contempt or anger towards Bingley is his freedom and his support? I mean, I bet Elizabeth would love to have some Miss Bingleys around her, like, who've got her back, I mean, sort of her aunt and uncle sort of have her back, but boy, she doesn't. I mean, she has the opposite of what Bingley has. Bingley has a whole group of people who are like, have a path for him to follow, even if it's not the path that he wants. And she's just got like the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Well, she's got a path people want her to follow, or at least.
But she doesn't have, her mother and her sisters and her father. I mean, that I put in the chat, that her father, when she's trying to actually like communicate with him, he's just, he dismisses women's emotions, going, oh, women like to be crossed in love. That she's just got this complete lack of any sort of, like I said, we don't have any good parenting in this novel. And she really does not have much of any sort of support structure, and doesn't have the kind of money that Bingley can just float from place to place, and he's got money, so he can do that, and she doesn't have that kind of freedom that money would allow.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what she has is Jane, who has her limitations as a support structure, and not Charlotte, who she thought she had, but maybe Mrs. Gardner, who comes in a bit. And I think that's an interesting stage of the novel, or of this volume, because we see them wrestling with the issues again of marriage, and you know, the pressures that both are on you to marry, but also on you to not marry, or to marry prudently. Cheryl?
Yes. So Fordyce and at some point says something about how being married is a service to the country, because you know, you're producing new citizens for the country. But when Elizabeth is looking back at her parents' marriage, she clearly sees that an unhappy marriage doesn't necessarily produce good citizens that are going to be productive members of society. And then I think it was the last week, Jacob was talking about the class, how Jane Austen is addressing class systems in this novel. And that's what we're talking about again today. And it's not just that Elizabeth doesn't have the money, but as a woman, she doesn't even have the ability to truly speak for herself, because when Mr. Collins asked her to marry him, think about how many times and in how many different ways she had to say, no, I don't want to marry you. And then later, Mr. Collins is like, well, I'm sure that after I speak to your parents, you know, this is going to go a different way. So again, she doesn't have freedom, because he knows that based on their societal structure, he can go talk to her parents and they can prevail upon her that she should get married to this man.
Yeah, and back to Fordyce that you brought up, and also this goes into what Marion was talking about before. I mean, the parental role in marriage is really key. I mean, Fordyce says a parent shouldn't force a child into marriage, but also a child or a daughter should not marry without the parent's consent. So, I mean, that her yes is very dependent on her father's yes, you know, on her father's permission. Since you're bringing up class, I did want to say at some point, since we have all these new characters coming in, I mean, the class representation we have here is really widening out with Lady Catherine and the others. What we learn is, I mean, there's a little bit of a family tree you can construct. Lady Catherine and Lady Anne Darcy, that is Mr. Darcy's mother, and the current Earl of Fitzwilliam, they are all, I mean, they're all the child of the old Earl of Fitzwilliam, who's dead before the novel starts, apparently. But anyway, so Lady Anne and Lady Catherine are styled lady as their courtesy titles. And those titles don't go down, but they're at kind of the top. They're in the peerage. So those, and Colonel Fitzwilliam is the younger son of an earl. So he's got status, but not so much, because he's not going to inherit. And as he tells us later, he doesn't have a lot of money. Now, I bet he has more than the Bennets do, but he doesn't have as much as he would want. So Darcy is the grandson of an earl and a very wealthy other person, apparently. Lady Catherine was married to Sir Louis de Burgh. We are not sure exactly what that means. He might be a knight. He might have been created a knight like Sir William Lucas. He might be a baronet and have an inherited title, but that's a lower kind of inherited title, and it doesn't qualify him for the House of Lords or anything like that. So we've got those people. And then Sir William Lucas, we know, used to be just the mayor of the town and in trade. The Bingley family made a lot of money in trade. Now they're looking to buy land to establish themselves as landed gentry. The Bennets are landed gentry now, but as soon as Mr. Bennet goes, that's over. You know, now then it's going to be Mr. Collins in there. So we've got all these, you know, this kind of wide range, but we start to realize how big a role money is playing in all this. Yeah, Jacob?
Yeah, two more additional points about class. It's remarkable. I mean, this is why I assume Lady Catherine is so opinionated, because she has the wealth and status to say what she wants. And
Right.
so much so, kind of, you know, funnily so, or in a humorous way, in that even men like Mr. Collins are so obnoxiously deferent to her that they don't challenge her. And there's that remarkable moment, I can't remember which chapter, where Elizabeth, despite class, goes head to head with Lady Catherine's opinion. And
Yes.
Lady Catherine is flabbergasted, doesn't know what to do. Who is this girl? What age is this? Is when we hear her age, and she's really stunned by it. I mean, that's a real a good tete-a-tete in that part. And there's another thing I was going to say. I thought this was gutsy from Jane Austen when she makes fun of the father of the Collinses, who is a knight. Is that right? Is he knighted?
Oh,
Sorry,
Lucas.
the Lucas.
Yeah.
Okay. I
Sir
thought that
William
was
Lucas,
hilarious. That's what a knight looks like now, who is deferent to a woman. He's deferent to Lady Catherine and doesn't really have any opinions to say. And he kind of cancels himself in any participation as a character. So those are just two really gutsy things Austen does, shows with class.
Well, with Sir William in particular, I mean, he gets made a knight because he gave a speech to, you know, the king or something like that at some point when he was mayor, and gets knighted for that. So, I mean, you see it just as a kind of meaningless political reward, but what does he do? He takes it and retires, and then becomes, I mean, now his job is just to be courteous to people. Yeah. So, Marcia.
There's a telling sentence about Lady Catherine. Mr. Collins tells Elizabeth, Lady Catherine likes to have likes to preserve, what does she say? Likes to have the distinctions
of rank. Yeah.
The distinctions of rank. So they didn't really call it class at that time. Class, our references to class referred to in the 19th century when economic classes were described and politicized. At that time, it was rank. I mean, it means the same thing in a way, but although the analysis of the class structure really came out of an economic analysis, and it pretty much holds true. But there were, and by the 20th century, there were lots of these people who were in the rank of the aristocracy, but who didn't have a lot of money. But at this time, I think we could assume that class and rank probably went together.
Yeah, you mean money and rank, or
well, class being, if you think of class as being mainly economic designation, they were pretty much the same.
There was a sentence too that you're kind of picking up. Elizabeth's courage did not fail her. This is on 158. She had heard nothing of Lady Catherine that spoke her awful, that is, you know, worthy of engendering awe, awful from any extraordinary talents or miraculous virtue. And the mere stateliness of money and rank, she thought she could witness without trepidation. So, I mean, that's what Lady Catherine brings to the table, the money and the rank, and that's something that Elizabeth is not overawed by.
Right.
Cheryl.
So the only other Jane Austen I've read was Persuasion, where she gets more, I think, well, I haven't read anything else. So she gets more involved in the social class, financial status discussion. But I wanted to correct something I'd said, I think in week 1, that this was about Victorian England, which it is not. It's the Regency period. And so King George is going crazy on the throne. And this is going to link back to Lady Catherine and the assumption that Miss de Bourgh is more handsome than any other woman strictly because of her social class. So this is the Regency period, and thinking about the the supposed superiority of the ruling class and the distinctions of rank. But if you have enough money, you can be good enough, right? Mr. Bingley's new money, and he's good enough. Mr. Darcy isn't even titled, but he's like a 1%er. So, he's good enough to be in all of these circles.
Yeah, and for Darcy, it's not merely money. It's also the Darcys are an old family, I think.
Okay.
Plus it's, and you get a sense that Lady Anne Fitzwilliam would not have married Mr. Darcy's father if that family hadn't been equivalent. That family seems to share some traits of pride in lineage, I think. One thing I want to also throw into this mix about the whole Lady Catherine and the powers of her rank and status. She and Mr. Darcy both have patronage in the church, which means they have livings to get rid of, or not to get rid of, but when the current holder of the parish church dies, that living then comes available, and she can bestow it, or he can bestow it on anyone he wants. So, and they might even, depending on how large their land holdings are, they might have several livings in their control. So that's one of the reasons that Charlotte and Mr. Collins, Mr. Collins is just grateful because she chose him, but Charlotte, we keep seeing, has an eye out for other livings that may come up that would mean more income for them. So she's thinking at the end of this section that we read about the fact that, well, Colonel Fitzwilliam's not going to have any, influence or patronage in the church, but Darcy will. So that in itself would make him a good, person to keep on the right side of.
And a good person for Elizabeth, right?
Right.
Charlotte's thinking of that as well.
Yeah, but she's thinking of that too, not just in terms of Elizabeth's needs, but in terms of her own connection to Elizabeth. And so, yeah. And here's one more thing about Sir Louis de Bourgh. Lady Catherine tells us in this section that Sir Louis de Bourgh's family did not find it necessary to entail the estate on heirs male, which means Lady Catherine inherited that estate. She does have a lot of power. It's not power that only is derived from men. It's now hers, and she can do what she wants. So here we have this really powerful woman that still Elizabeth is standing up to. Yeah, Monica.
So how frequent then was this situation where there was not an entail? So it's possible that they could have set this up without an entail. How possible was that?
I think what you do the entail, that's the thing that takes the effort. But people did it to keep the estates together. If you think about, say, Longbourn, that's not a huge estate, probably. it's big enough. But if you've got a son and 4 daughters or 5 daughters, and you're dividing that estate up in 5, then you've got less power. So it became something, especially in the 18th century, that was an attempt, and it worked in with the laws of primogeniture. It was an attempt to consolidate political power in the hands of the landed classes. Because if they kept dividing, pretty soon nobody would have anything. And then how would you know who the important people were? Now, once you get into an entail, then it's complicated. I mean, because you've got to wait till there's an heir, and then you can, they can spend some money to break the entail. But, and that's what Mr. Bennet was waiting to do. He was waiting to get a son, and then they could break the entail and carve off some money to allow the daughters to have something. But what the daughters have is pretty much just what came into the marriage with Mrs. Bennet. And she's only the daughter of a country attorney. Yeah, John.
Oh, I'm on. Excuse me. I'm a recovering lawyer. I'm a retired lawyer, and I was interested in this entail thing because I've seen it before, but I never had to. I felt like to really understand this, what was going on here, I needed to look at it, and I'll just tell y'all my understanding of it is that it's part of the common law of England, and it is still there today. And it is not a part of the law of this country because there were several colonies where entail was part of the common law, the colonies in the United States, including the middle colonies and including the southern colonies. And what did away with this entail in this country was Jefferson drafted a statute that overruled it by comment, that overruled entail, did away with the principle of entail, and every state where entail existed adopted that statute. And that's why it is not a part of the fabric, if you will, of this country, and it was eliminated very early. And I'm not sure if it was totally eliminated before the nation, was formed, or whether it was until after after we became a nation, after the independence. But it was eliminated by a statute drafted by Jefferson that was adopted by every other state or every other colony or state that followed it entail.
Yeah, if you're interested in more on entail, go to the jasna.org website, and there's a search function, and you can just type in entail or entailment, and you'll come up with a lot of essays from Persuasions and Persuasions Online that you can access from there that deal with it, both in Austen's personal life and just in the novels and how it's used. So it's kind of helpful. But yeah, and I think the voting franchise in England was also based on income and property. So that gives us another sense of why it played such a role in England and not so much in the new country, which had different requirements. That's my non-lawyerly perspective. Well, going back to Elizabeth for a moment, and that sense of her anger and her her anger and grumpiness, and her resistance against these social mores. I mean, it's really interesting, I think, in the way it comes out in her experience of Wickham over these few chapters. I mean, we first have a sense that they continue to have this nice little relationship, that seems to be going well. They're having fun together, and then in walks Mrs. Gardner and has advice to give, and then we see that relationship kind of fizzling, and Elizabeth's response to that. Yeah, Cheryl, did you have something to?
I got very fortunate at the used bookstore. I got the Jane Austen for Dummies and a Spark Notes version, but I had already read Persuasions edited by David M. Shepard. And so I would say that I recommend this for first time readers because his annotations are like extremely thorough. But so Wickham, I don't know if his character is ever going to be redeemed. I think that he is selfish, and I don't know that I have finished the book, but I'm not doing spoilers, right? So, but I just really don't know if he will be a good guy. But it's so interesting how little time period they have for courtship. The 30 minutes perhaps for a dance or two. And then at the beginning of chapter 3, Mrs. Gardner is saying that to Lizzie, you are too sensible a girl, Lizzie, to fall in love merely because you are warned against it. And therefore, I am not afraid of speaking openly, talking about Wickham. So on the one hand, Lizzie's like, well, Jane didn't have enough time to get to know Bingley. But then on the other hand, Lizzie herself wants to get Wickham's affections in that same short time period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and there's a moment in these chapters where the narrator says, Elizabeth less clear-sighted about her own situation than Charlotte's. And so I think that's one of the interesting things about Elizabeth here is that we see her perspective and her judgment in flux in a real way. Yeah. Joellen? Joellen, you're muted, I think. You're still muted?
Thanks. I'm going to try to talk. No, can you hear me?
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah,
Yes.
good.
Okay, I've got a really unstable internet in the hotel though, so give me a yell if you're not hearing me. But I find it interesting in this slow read that the Elizabeth we love, etc., we're really focusing on taking a much closer look at her. And in fact, part of that you just mentioned, she trusted her reading of Bingley. She says she has his character early on. And later when he's gone, she doesn't believe the sister. She thinks she knows that Bingley loves her sister, but she's completely off on Wickham. So we've noticed that everything she says is kind of counterintuitive there. But a couple of things come to mind. Sir William has been her only experience of a sir, as so far as we know. And I went back, kind of thought back to the beginning and the fact that he was involved with Elizabeth and Darcy dancing and all this stuff. But I want to set aside for a minute the fact that we've always said that she took offense when Darcy said she was not handsome enough to tempt me. And I want to draw attention to another phrase that he was not interested in women other men had slighted. That, I think, would have cut her more deeply and rattled her. She's been very confident, courageous, she says, about how she responds to people, but she's thrown off by Darcy. Bingley she can handle, Darcy she's in deeper waters. Is Elizabeth a reader? Also occurred to me. Darcy prefers conversation and reading, and who knows whether Elizabeth could actually keep up with him in that area, whether that does throw her off some. But in any case, I really have just thought that maybe she isn't as confident as we've kind of thought she was. And that helps affect some of her responses here. And I don't want to say vengeful, but she does not forget that slight whatsoever.
No.
And all of that, I think it's woven together here to some extent.
Even at the end of the book, she still remembers it. You know, it does not.
Oh, yes.
I mean, I think, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, she says all that stuff to her aunt, like, well, I don't know if I can be as wise as you want me to, you know, and not pursuing this interest in Wickham, but I'll think about it. And I won't push myself to fall in love, or I won't push to have him included in everything. And then we learn about Miss King, right? Here's Miss King, who's inherited 10,000 pounds from her grandfather's death. And all of a sudden, Wickham is paying court to Miss King. And when Mrs. Gardner finds out about that, she says, well, I'd hate to think, you know, he was mercenary. And Elizabeth gets really defensive. You know, I mean, you didn't want him to marry me. So why shouldn't he go and marry somebody who has 10,000 pounds? And Mrs. Gardner says, yeah, but it's not that. He went only because she had 10,000 pounds. And Elizabeth says, where's the difference between the mercenary and the prudent motive? You know, a man in straitened circumstances or distressed circumstances may not have time for all of the elegant decorums that other people may observe. And I mean, she's really moving into this kind of very pragmatic view of marriage that pushes even beyond, I think, Charlotte's. Yeah, Cheryl? Cheryl?
Yes, I'm just going to quote you on saying the difference between the mercenary and the prudent motives. And that's exactly what Austen is discussing. Remember, the first volume starts with the need to be married and it ends with the entailment. And if Mrs. Bennet weren't so funny looking at resumes of potential husbands for her daughters would be extremely inappropriate and distasteful. But this is their reality. Charlotte made a very prudent decision to marry Mr. Collins. It wasn't mercenary, it wasn't selfish. This is her livelihood. This is how she's going to eat, to have a shelter day by day. But then one of my favorite quotes is when in the second volume, here it is. When Mr. Collins said anything of which his wife might reasonably be ashamed, which certainly was not unseldom, she involuntarily turned her eye on Charlotte.
Yeah.
Just because of his character, how he is.
Well, I think that's great. And thank you for moving us into the second half of this section, because the road trip, because I think, you know, the road trip is something we really want to talk about. One of the things that the road trip helps us do is look at these marriages, you know, one marriage now that Suzanne was bringing up, the marriage between Mr. Collins and Charlotte. And here we are evaluating that in terms of how well it worked. What does Elizabeth see, or what do we see in terms of strengths and weaknesses of the Collins marriage? Yeah, Monica.
Well, I love that we get Charlotte's very practical. I encourage him to like go play in the garden as much as, and our rooms are really far apart. And she took the room that was less likely for him to be next to. And so we get this really wonderfully, I mean, it's also funny, but this great pragmatic, you know, sense of this is how you make a marriage with an obnoxious husband work.
Mm-hmm. Maybe with any husband. I mean, what she's doing actually is carving out her own space, right? But yeah, it's particularly necessary here. Elta?
One other thing about that I admire about Charlotte is that she also does not talk about him in a derogatory fashion to her best friend, which she so easily could do, and which Elizabeth Bennet would likely encourage because she finds him so repugnant, and he is. But you know, Charlotte has, I like what Cheryl said. Yeah, this is her. It's like taking a job that you really don't like, but you really need to do it in order to survive. And that's what she has with Mr. Collins, but she's making the best of it by not overtly in any way looking down on him.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you're right. But also I'd say, I mean, this is part of what Cheryl was saying. That line, Charlotte wisely did not hear, you know, when Mr. Collins says ridiculous things. And one of the things I think we get here is this sense that, you know, Charlotte has to close off a large part of her intelligence. I mean, that's what's been sacrificed to this marriage, you know, not to, you know, she needs to maintain her relationships outside the family. She's not going to get, you know, this from a Lady Catherine, who's got a whole different kind of relationship. So she's only now living in part of herself. And I think, well, certainly it's understandable the bargain she's made. There's part of it that's kind of sad, you know, that she was somebody that we saw as meeting Elizabeth as an intellectual equal, and she's not going to have that experience of marriage. Jacob?
I think there's a stunning paragraph in chapter 3 in volume 2 that starts with the wedding took place, where we hear the sadness. I think Jane Austen's pretty clear that there's this moment where Elizabeth is watching all of it happen, and she says something like, or she's thinking, Elizabeth could never address her without feeling that all the comfort of intimacy was over. And though determined not to slacken as a correspondent, it was for the sake of what had been rather than what was. I mean, she's essentially, what you're saying, she's watching the loss of a friend. She's watching watching the loss of a confidant, or as you're bringing up, an equal, and she's going, and she knows she's not going to come back. I think Delta Wedding really tried to explore that in ways, or Welty had that sense of like, there's a kind of sadness to sending a daughter off. She's going to change. She's going to become, in a way, she is. I think Charlotte is settling, and she's letting go of a part of her.
And all this kind of, I mean, I love the way you're pointing up that sadness there and that sense of loss, because it combines with that anger. And when she says to Mrs. Gardner, stupid men are the only ones worth knowing after all, we realize that, whoa, she's in a, this is a dangerous spot, you know, that if that's how she feels, where is she going to end up? And how long will that feeling last? Joellen.
I think that it's interesting, though, that Elizabeth is in her own mind, changing her mind about Charlotte's life. And when she's talking with Darcy later in this section, she says that she even appears to be happy enough, so that she's definitely done some real shifting in her thinking.
That's interesting. So that's the conversation I think that Suzanne is worried about when Elizabeth is talking to Darcy and saying these things about Mr. Collins to him.
I wonder, Susan, does this suggest that Elizabeth recognizes a sympathetic or a similar sensibility in Darcy to her own? And I think she's confiding in him here, and it's and she's rejecting him in every other way, but there is this kind of confidence at this moment.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, he's somebody that she can talk to. She
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily agree with him, but I mean, that sense of the meeting of minds seems always to be available there.
Yeah, that's kind of what I think. She says to him, he says, Mr. Collins appears very fortunate in his choice of a wife. And she says, yes, indeed, his friends may well rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him or have made him happy if they had.
Yeah.
My friend has an excellent understanding, though I'm not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and in a prudential light, it is certainly a very good match for her. So, there's a kind of exchange with Darcy that suggests that they are on the same wavelength here, I think. But
Yeah,
it's very critical of Collins.
and I wonder if any of this also might have to do with Elizabeth's desire to separate herself from her mother. Because from her mother, it's any marriage is a good. And maybe is there part of Elizabeth, however conscious that or unconscious, that wants to make clear that she looks at marriages critically and doesn't necessarily think any marriage is the unalloyed good that her mother might. Marcia?
There's another clue. Remember when Mr. Darcy says at the piano, we neither of us performed to strangers. There are little clues along here that they are suitable for each other. And there's it's interesting to me when he visits alone at the parsonage, he says to Elizabeth, you have not always lived only in Hertfordshire, have you? And I think he is so impressed with her in the way she's so different from her mother and the rest of her family that he thinks she must have gone to a boarding school or something, that she is so polished that he can't imagine that she has just been in that village with those people.
Or in London at Grace Church Street.
Or either, right.
And we probably have time for 2 more comments. So we've got 2 more people's hands raised.
Okay. All right, Joellen.
I was just going to remark that I think there's a really nice, it's a really great thing to put a parallel together between when at Netherfield, when Elizabeth was staying there, Bingley is teasing Darcy about and talking about defects, and he's a big, tall, fine fellow. And remember, at a certain point, Elizabeth pulls back. She checks what she was going to say because she's quite sure that Darcy had taken offense. And in the same section that Marcia just brought up, his cousin Fitzwilliam is doing a similar kind of thing, talking about that he won't take the trouble to learn how to talk with people. And Darcy defends himself rather well. He says, I have trouble catching the tone of conversations of people I don't know, etc. Elizabeth comes back saying, yes, but I don't play so well, but I blame myself. And he says, you are perfectly right. And that leads to that moment that Marcia just quoted. So there's a real development here, even in looking at those 2 passages.
Yeah, that's great. Cheryl, did you have something you wanted to say? Your hand was up.
It was, but then I was following the timeline. Here's all I have to say is that when Harriet in one of the other meetings said that it's important to focus on the time that they're writing about and the time that they're writing in, and the Lucy, whatever her last name is, biography of Jane Austen. Just, I think so much about how Jane Austen made the decision to decline a proposal, and she did this before she was writing First Impressions, which became Pride and Prejudice. So I think it would be beneficial to our group if you have time to watch the biography, so that we can be thinking about where Jane Austen was in her headspace when she was writing this novel. That's it.
Okay. Next time we will finish volume 2, which means we're winding up the trip to Hunsford and going back to Longbourn and Meryton then and seeing how, you know, what, if anything, has changed either internally or externally. So we can pick up more of what happened in the chapters we didn't get to talk about. Okay.
Things are starting to pop.
Yes, they are.
See you on October 10th.
Okay.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.